I call
Mr.
the
Chair.
Honourable Phil Goff?
Mr. Chairman, I want to first comment on the extraordinary contributions made by ministers in the chair tonight. First of all, we had an appalling attack from Chris Finlayson, the Attorney-General, denigrating people like Dame Anne Salmond, who's just become New Zealander of the Year, and Sir Geoffrey Palmer, it seemed for reasons that Mr. Finlayson didn't like the lectures he gave when he was a Year 1 student. But yeah, I think it was jealous, or maybe it was just sheer bitchiness, actually, I think is the best way of describing it. But I regret the fact that when prominent New Zealanders who have contributed so much to this country speak out against a piece of legislation because they see that legislation as breaching fundamental rights set out in our own Bill of Rights Act and in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the response from the government is to denigrate the people who complain about the right of protest being breached. And that man is Attorney-General. He has the responsibility to uphold the Bill of Rights, and yet he is supporting a piece of legislation that the government didn't have the guts to put before a select committee or to get the normally required submission from the Attorney-General as to whether this legislation is in fact in breach of the Bill of Rights. And then we had an unbalanced contribution from the Honourable Nick Smith. That's the only way I can describe it. He had the temerity to talk about jobs. He talked about balance, and I'll come to that in a minute. He talked about balance. This is a government that has destroyed the balance in the Resource Management Act that once existed between conservation values and development. A carefully crafted piece of legislation that has lasted through successive governments and been endorsed by successive governments, that they are ripping apart to the extent that a prominent member of the National Party, Guy Salmond, who actually does believe in conservation values, has said it's an absolute disgrace that his national government is putting through something like that. So Nick Smith has some cheek talking about balance in this House. But then he came into this House to talk about jobs. This was all about jobs, he said. This from a government that has destroyed more jobs than it's created in the last 5 years. Destroyed 30,000 more jobs than it's created. And they're talking about mining. Mining is one of the areas where proportionately they've destroyed the most jobs. And then in the House today they were going to destroy another 1,300 in the hospital wards so they could give frozen pre-cooked meals to sick patients who need decent nutrition. Don't come in here, Dr. Smith, and talk about balance and jobs, because you're on very weak grounds on both fronts. But what I really want to object about in this bill, well, actually, there's another thing I want to object about. It's something that Simon Bridges said. You know, I think arrogance is often proportionate to youth, but Simon Bridges had the cheek to say that rights were a two-way process. A two-way process. You know, it's terrible. They have to protect those huge multinationals with all of their resources and all of their wealth and all of their power against the ordinary New Zealander that has no wealth, has no resources and has no right other than the right of protest, and now they want to take away that right of protest. That's a disgrace. Don't come in here, Mr. Bridges, and talk about rights being a two-way process, because what this government is doing is simply being an apologist once again for the multinational companies that come to this country and want to take from this country rather than give to this country. You know, Warner Brothers came here and they walked away laughing at the naivety and the amateurism of the Prime Minister, who handed out another $67 million to Warner Brothers and then gave them a piece of law that his own legal advisors said wasn't even necessary. So here we have another example. We've got Warner Brothers, we've got Sky City, and now we've got the multinational oil companies that this government has decided that they will bring in a law abrogating the long-standing right of protest on the seas in order to satisfy the big business that came along to them and said, we want you to do this. And Simon Bridges, young and as naive as he is, immediately brings into the House an SOP that he never put before the Select Committee to judge whether it had substance and whether it was appropriate. You know, the fundamental thing about democracy in this House is that legislation goes to a Select Committee. And before the Select Committee ordinary New Zealanders can have their say. Simon Bridges has stopped ordinary New Zealanders having their say on this piece of legislation, and that's a disgrace. This is obnoxious legislation brought in by bad process. And everyone, Mr Chairman,
I call the honourable member Pasata Sam Lotu-Iiga.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I move that the question be now put.
I'm going to take